I'm Tarot Oracle. We're continuing our series on tarot symbolism with the swords, starting out with the ace. Now, the ace is a pretty interesting card because it's quite packed with stuff, or with things that are interesting to look at. One is obviously the cloud, representing the connection to the divine, or connection to something that's higher to ourselves. Obviously the gigantic hand coming out of the ether, again representing a higher power. A higher power is delivering something to us. So instead of being a gift, you notice in other aces you have a gift. In other words, a hand will hold out a gift. This one is firmly grasping it, meaning it's demonstrating, or it's presenting this power. It's presenting this grand communication with us. It's not something that we are being given, but it's something that is being demonstrated. So it's the difference between a hand held out and a hand actually gripping, holding onto something. So obviously it's holding the sword, meaning the grand communication, the beginning of communication, new communication, but it also has a crown sort of floating, being held up by absolutely nothing at the top. And the crown represents the power, the power of that grand communication, or the power of communication. So we have a new journey with communication, or something new going on, but we also are able to get that power with it. And you also have sort of these licks of fire or sunlight that are sort of coming down. Obviously you don't see any sun around here, but these little licks of fire or sunlight are in TDMs and other card decks. But those represent that fire influence, or that ability to launch into this new venture that we're going into, and things like that. So we have the mountains in the distance. Obviously you have that distant effect of the bluish mountains, meaning they're far away. The atmospheric effect, and that means that we do have troubles, or we do have challenges ahead, but we're going to be able to handle that no problem, because we have this grand communication. Now we also have the life-giving power of the branches, and the branches are hooked in there well. So one interesting thing about this card, if you'll notice, the branches aren't just sort of barely hanging on. They're hooked in there quite well. I mean, we have the two hooks that are hooked in there well. They're not coming off, they're not going anywhere, they're firm. So that life-giving aspect, or that life aspect of the card, is firm. It's something that's going to really be there. It's going to be very present. And you have two different types of branches, meaning the two different types of life, or the multiple types of life. So it's not just a gift of life, or it's not just a presentation of this grand communication, but the communication also has the power, it has the influence, it has the knowledge of the king or queen, and it's something that really can't be denied. And the crown isn't at the bottom, the crown is up top, meaning this is a very powerful influence. This is something big. So near the bottom we have that fiery influence, and that fiery influence is sort of launching us up the top, or almost launching that crown up into the top. So it's a lot of interesting symbology within here, and a very fascinating card, something to always look forward to have in your readings. And the next card is going to be the Two of Swords, and the Two of Swords is obviously represented by a younger woman, by the way, not an older one like the Hermit or one of the kings or queens. It's a younger woman. And the younger woman is sort of closed off. We have multiple things telling us that she's closed off. One is obviously the blindfold, but she's not handcuffed, or her hands are not bound. So this is a voluntary blindfold. It's almost like she put it on herself. She could easily take it off. She doesn't want to. She wants to be closed off from the communication. And you have obviously the closed off body language with her arms crossed. And you have that upper body closed off, but the lower body is not, which is interesting. So it's like that upper body, that heart, the throat, the ears, the eyes, and everything else are closed off. She doesn't want anything to do with what you're saying. She doesn't want anything to do with what's going on with the communication. Now, she does have the swords, obviously a protective element, so she can fight with the swords if need be. But now she's using them again as additional protection. So she's not only closed off, she's closed off with quite a bit of protection with two different swords. Now we have multiple varieties of landscape in here. We have the stability brought in by the little pillar that she's sort of sitting on. And we have the innocence or the purity represented by the white robe that she's wearing. You'll notice there's only one color. It's white, right? Obviously you have the tinting of the bluish night sky, which I think that's the tinting. I don't think it's actually a bluish white, but I think it's white. It's being tinted by the offset of the sky. So we have the communication here of the moon, and the moon represents that intuitive sense that we have. So she's not only communicating, but communicating intuitively, but she's just closed off to everything. She's voluntarily closed off. Now again, we have the mountain representing challenges. The challenges are in the distance, but she's facing away from them. She doesn't want anything to do with those as well, so she's sort of ignoring that. And then we have the water representing that part of us that's being cleansed, or the part of us that's being cleaned. And the water again will have a cleaning influence, but it's not actually touching her. We just have this concrete here, so she has a separation from the cleansedness of the water. She doesn't really want anything to do with what's behind her. Again, she's closed off not only from behind, but from up front as well. So it's interesting just how closed off she is. I mean, she can't really be any more closed off other than crossing her legs. So it's a very interesting card, and it's a very sort of a stop sign that you have to communication, or a stop sign that we have to dealing with the outside world, or dealing with whatever the problem is, or whatever the situation is. She really doesn't want anything to do with it. So interesting card of the Two of Swords. Now next we have the Three of Swords, obviously representing heartbreak. Not much to say about this card. Not much to say at all. The clouds, obviously a link with the divine, or a link to something greater than ourselves. And it's also raining. So it's pretty obvious that this means heartbreak, or being stabbed in the heart, or something like this. Not really a lot to go on here other than they're being crossed. So it's one thing that I noticed with every one of these cards is all the swords are crossed. They could have been all vertical, but no, they're crossed. They're all touching. And that could represent sort of a double cross, or a triple cross, a double cross. You know what I'm saying? It could represent that crossing of communication. So the communication was crossed really poorly, or we had a crossing of communication that didn't go well. Maybe we had a three-way crossing of communication that didn't go well. But this pretty much represents heartbreak and bad communication, communication that went poorly. And the rain sort of influences this as well, as, you know, it just can't get any worse. Other than blood dripping, well, we have rain dripping over here, but other than blood dripping from the actual heart, I mean, this is pretty as bad as it gets as far as the swords goes. So it's communication that went sour, communication that went bad. And I think we sort of have this snake influence over here as well, which is interesting. So yeah, just always remember, in addition to the stab through the heart, that all of them are crossed. So it's an interesting thing that I noticed that I wanted to let you know about as well. But, you know, one of those things, they're all crossed. And what does that mean? Does that mean the communications got crossed? Something got miscommunicated? What exactly does that mean? So within the realm of the swords I'm talking about, because the swords are obviously about communication. So what does that mean? So next, obviously, we have the Four, and the Four is rather interesting because it's one of those things to where I don't really think that that's a real person. And you can see that represented over here too. I don't really think that's a person because a person doesn't, you know, look like that, obviously. So that's more of a sort of a stone feature. So it's something carved out of stone. So it's not really someone resting. It's more of a, you know, it's an art. Someone built that, and that's sort of being represented in both cards. So it's very lifeless feel as well. So it's sort of like a lot of people look at this and they'll say someone's sleeping, but in my opinion, again, people don't look like that. And that sort of reinforces it as well, that it's more of a statue rather than a real person. In addition, if they were dead or anything like that, nobody really, dies in that position type thing. So that's just my opinion with it. I think that that is more of a statue than an actual person. But the statue has quite a bit of interesting things about him. Number one, he's wearing armor. So it seems that he is protected, and he's protected from at least one of the swords that are coming down him. In addition, he is praying, so he's trying to connect himself to something divine, or trying to connect himself to something maybe in an afterlife as well. So we have three swords coming over here. Now what's interesting is their position. One is sort of the head chakra, right? The head. Another is sort of right above the heart, and then another, it looks like it's about at the stomach level. So it's interesting that we have the position of the three swords sort of pointing out some of the major organs, or some of the major, things that are up top, or the top side. And you also see the top side represented here as well. So we have nothing really going on the bottom, but we have quite a bit going on the top. And the same thing here. So the same thing here, we don't really have anything going on in the bottom section. We just have the top with the three swords pointing to some of the vital pieces of the body. Now, obviously, we have the stained glass with the lady, and the lady appears to be giving something to a child. So interesting as well. So it's almost like a memory of life. So the statue may be dead, the statue may not have any life, but it's almost as if he's reaching up and looking at, not really looking at, but reaching up and remembering something with his life, maybe his wife and his child or something like that. So we have that connection between life and stillness. So the last thing to notice, obviously, is the sword on the bottom. And the sword on the bottom is obviously a different color than the other three. So we have these three swords sort of pointing out to interesting parts of the body, but the lower sword is not pointing to anything. The lower sword is sort of making him as being surrounded. In addition, the lower sword is also part of the statue. So we have the sword with the statue, and we have the swords up top. Now, if you combine all of them, he is surrounded. So that's another interesting part. He's surrounded. And the sword is pointing towards the left, which could do good stuff with card interactions. So it could be pointing to this card, for example. So what is being referred to in this card? Going back to my card interactions. But it is interesting. So you have the three, and then you have the one. And they are very separated. They're very different. And they are surrounding this individual. So it's an interesting card, and again, a lot of people look at it and say resting or something like that, but again, I think it sort of maybe represents resting, but I think it's an actual statue as per looking at both cards. It's an interesting part of the symbology, and it's something to look at and think about. Another interesting thing that you'll notice is the line separating the mother and the child. It's almost like that they were separated, that they have some sort of a separation going on, maybe caused by the separation of the father or something like that. But I've always found it interesting. There's not one stain. I realize that could be one stained glass and another stained glass. But as far as symbology is concerned, I find it interesting that the mother is separated from the child. So, hopefully you've learned something new or seen something new in the card that you haven't thought of before. And let's move on to the final and 5 of swords. All right, and lots of symbology with here. So obviously 5 of swords, I believe it means defeat, is a weird card. It's an unusual card. And both of these have completely different representations of this card. For instance, this person's heavily armored, this person not so much. And I find that totally interesting. And this person is like almost purposefully stabbing the sword into the ground, while this person is sort of casually holding it and just barely balancing it within his hand. So obviously this represents defeat. Now the winner in both cards has quite a bit of red on him, right? A red outfit on the bottom, representing that fire or that resourcefulness or the dominance from that feel of red. And then we have the yellow, or the sort of the lighter color, the milder color of the two characters that were defeated. So it's interesting just how dynamically different these two are. I mean, he is heavily armored with the gloves and the armor, the helmet, or anything, and this guy doesn't have any of that. So he is, of course, wearing sort of the orangish feel down here, which again has that red feel, or that red piece. And then he has that green, almost the difference, the color difference, the primary color difference between the red and the green. So we do have the clouds. Again, maybe the connection with the divine, but in this particular card, it seems the clouds represent sort of bad news. Or the 5 is never a good number, but the clouds sort of represent bad news, or something that just didn't go quite well. And obviously it didn't go well for these two. And again, we have the challenges or obstacles of the mountains in the distance, and the cleansing of the water. And you'll notice these two are walking sort of towards the water and towards that cleansing influence to sort of recover from being defeated by this person. So you notice the two swords on the ground, obviously belonging to the two people that were defeated. And it looks like there were two separate defeats. And I say this because one person is farther away than the next. So it's almost like this person in the distance tried to defeat him first, and then he lost. And then this person tried to defeat him next, and then he lost. So that's why you have a separation of distance between the two characters, in my opinion. I think he won 2 fights, and obviously he has 5 swords. Now, what's interesting about him holding it is he has these 2 swords here. Obviously, those aren't, obviously he can't fight with 3 swords. So it's like he collected those 2 swords, and he collected the 2 swords from the 2 people that he defeated. But the 2 swords on the ground, obviously, in my opinion, represent other people that were defeated later. In other words, he's not holding 4 swords in his left hand. He's holding 2. So I think that 2 people earlier in the day or earlier in time were defeated. And then he has the 2 in the hand right now for the 2 people on the screen here on the card that have been defeated. So he has that wind-blown hair effect, meaning I think that it's sort of windy, it's sort of an action, and I think it's one of those things where you see the cards where people have the wind-blown hair, they have a lot of action. So I think he's just had a lot of action. He's ready for action. But you'll notice these two, their hair is not being blown in the wind like his is. So I think that his hair being blown back represents that action, represents that ability, or that influence, that sort of, I'm ready for action, here I go feel. But the other 2 that have been defeated don't have that. So I think that his readiness and his alertness and his ability to do that action or something like that led to him being able to defeat those 2. Now, if you look over here at these, I'm not sure if that's a helmet or not, but it looks like they don't have any armor, and he does. So I think he had a huge advantage over, for example, these other 2. I think he had a huge advantage over these 2. And the armor really sort of pushes over the top that defeat, or that preparation, or that readiness. So if you are defeated, maybe you can come back and be more ready the next time. So it seems like that's the main theme of the card, with the clouds being obviously the bad news, and the mountains in the atmospheric distance between the mountains, but whatever. But those sort of represent that feeling of obstacles that they're going to run into after they have been defeated. So an interesting card, and that is the final card of today's Tarot and Symbology. And I want to take a moment to thank all our Patreon supporters. Patreon is a place where you can go and donate to support my cause. My cause being obviously doing all of this good stuff, doing lessons, doing readings, free readings, etc., etc. My Patreon supporters are Adam G., Alley Cat, Annie Lemaster, Carmen Gabrieno, Carolyn Bouchard, Crystal McGinn, Fatima, Gary Fink, Hot Chocolate, Jessica Mante, Kim Wilson, KSW, La Ami, Richard Zeh, Scott Miller, Shintaro Kuga, Sinai Zamora, and Trino Iaverio. If you would like to help me and support me as well, I would appreciate it. Any donation would be greatly appreciated to pay all the software stuff that I use. So if you'd like to do that, link in the description. And as always, please hit like and subscribe. And of course, thank you so much for watching. Next time we'll continue with the swords and get some more cool stuff done. See you then.